The knock on the door came at midnight, and Elena Voss knew before she opened it that her life was about to change forever. Her father stood there, his face pale, his hands shaking, holding a folded letter with a wax seal she did not recognize. He did not say good evening. He did not ask if she was awake. He simply stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and said the words that would break her world apart. He told her that in 3 weeks she would marry a man she had never met, a man named Damian Cross, the alpha of one of the most powerful packs in the region. Elena stood frozen in the doorway of her bedroom, staring at her father as though he had spoken in a language she did not understand. She was 24 years old, and until this moment, she believed she had some say in her own future. She believed that when she fell in love, it would be her choice. She believed her father, despite his flaws, would never sell her future to save his own. She was wrong. Gerald Voss sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, the letter still clutched in his hand like it might disappear if he let go. He explained, in a voice that cracked more than once, that the family textile business was drowning in debt, not the ordinary kind of debt that could be repaid with patience and hard work, but the kind that came with threats, with men who visited in the night, with warnings that the next visit would not be so polite. He had borrowed money from the wrong people, and now those people wanted their money back with interest that could never be paid. The Cross Pack, led by the aging but still formidable Alistair Cross, had offered a solution. A marriage between their two families, Elena's hand in exchange for the debt being erased, and the Voss name being protected. Gerald had said yes, before he ever thought to ask his daughter how she felt about spending the rest of her life with a stranger. Elena did not cry that night. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to her father apologize over and over, his voice growing smaller with each repetition, until the apologies meant nothing at all. She thought of every plan she had ever made for herself, the small bookshop she wanted to open, the quiet life she imagined, away from the politics of powerful families and the dangerous games they played. All of it dissolved in the space of a single conversation. When her father finally left the room, Elena walked to her window and looked out at the dark hills beyond her family's estate. Somewhere out there, in a mansion she had never seen, a man named Damian Cross was probably hearing the very same news. She wondered if he felt as trapped as she did. She wondered if he even cared. She had no way of knowing that, at that very moment, Damian Cross was standing in his own study, staring at a letter of his own, feeling a fear that had nothing to do with debt or duty. His fear was older than that, deeper than that. A fear he had carried since he was a teenager, hidden so carefully that even his closest friends did not fully understand it. Damian was 30 years old, tall, composed, and respected throughout the pack for his sharp mind and steady leadership. He had spent years proving himself worthy of his father's legacy, taking on responsibilities most men twice his age would have found overwhelming. He had built alliances, settled disputes, and earned the loyalty of hundreds of pack members. But none of that mattered tonight, because tonight, his father had walked into his study and told him it was time. Time to marry. Time to produce an heir. Time to finally become the man Alistair Cross needed him to be. Damian had known this conversation was coming for years. He had delayed it, deflected it, and buried himself in work to avoid it. But his father was growing older, and the pressure from the pack elders had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. A pack without a clear line of succession was a pack vulnerable to challenge, and Alistair Cross would not leave his life's work exposed to that kind of danger. His father did not ask him if he wanted to marry. He told him who he would marry: Elena Voss, daughter of a debt-ridden merchant family, a woman Damian had never met and knew almost nothing about. The arrangement, his father explained, would solve two problems at once. It would erase a debt that had become an embarrassment to associate with, and it would finally give Damian a wife, silencing the whispers that had followed him for years. Damian understood exactly what those whispers meant, even if his father never said the words directly. He knew what people suspected about him. He knew why some of the elders looked at him differently than they looked at other unmarried men his age. He had spent a decade being careful, being controlled, being exactly what everyone expected him to be on the surface, all while hiding the one truth that could unravel everything he had built. He was gay. He had known it since he was 17 years old, standing in a training yard, watching a boy named Ronan spar with another pack member, and feeling something he could not explain and did not dare name. Over the years, that feeling had never faded. It had only grown, quietly, painfully, into something he could not deny even to himself. Ronan was still by his side now, older, more scarred, serving as his second-in-command and closest confidant. Only Ronan knew the truth. Only Ronan understood why Damien flinched every time his father mentioned marriage, why he threw himself into pack business instead of courting the women who were regularly introduced to him, why he seemed to carry a weight that had nothing to do with leadership. Standing in his study that night, staring at the letter that sealed his fate, Damien felt something close to panic. Marriage would mean sharing his home, his life, his bed, with a woman he did not love and could never truly love, not in the way a husband should. It would mean lying every single day, to her, to his pack, to himself. It would mean burying the truth even deeper than before, until there might be no part of himself left that was real. He thought about refusing. He thought about standing up to his father and telling him the truth, letting the consequences fall where they may. But he knew what that truth would cost, not just his own position, but the safety of everyone connected to him. Packs in this world did not forgive weakness, and to the elders, what Damien truly was would be seen as exactly that, a weakness. A vulnerability that rival packs could exploit, a scandal that could tear apart everything his family had built for generations. So instead of refusing, Damien made a different decision. He would agree to the marriage, but he would set his own terms. He called for a private meeting with Gerald Voss before the engagement was formally announced, and in that meeting, away from his father's ears, he made something very clear. The marriage would happen. The debt would be erased, but it would be a marriage in name only. No expectations beyond appearances. No pressure for anything more than a public partnership that satisfied the pack's need for stability. He did not explain his reasons, and Gerald, desperate and relieved to have his family's crisis solved, did not ask questions. He simply agreed, grateful that his daughter's future husband seemed, at the very least, reasonable. What Gerald did not do was tell Elena about this private agreement. He returned home that night and told her only that the marriage was set, the date would be announced soon, and that she needed to prepare herself. He did not mention the conversation with Damien. He did not mention the strange, careful way the young alpha had spoken, choosing his words as though each one had been measured for danger. Gerald told himself it did not matter. His daughter would be safe, provided for, protected by one of the most powerful names in the region. That, to him, was enough. But it was not enough for Elena. In the days that followed, she tried everything she could think of to change her father's mind. She reminded him of promises he had made when she was younger, promises about choosing her own path, about never being forced into anything against her will. She reminded him of her mother, who had died when Elena was 12, and how her mother would never have allowed this to happen. Gerald listened to all of it with a heavy heart, but he did not change his answer. There was no other way, he told her, again and again, until the words lost all meaning. The debt would destroy them. The men who were owed money did not forgive, did not wait, and did not care about the dreams of a young woman who wanted a different life. Marrying Damien Cross was not a choice, it was survival. Elena eventually stopped arguing, not because she accepted her fate, but because she realized arguing changed nothing. She spent her nights sitting by her window instead, watching the stars, trying to imagine the man she was about to marry. She had heard his name mentioned in passing over the years, always with a note of respect. People spoke of Damien Cross as fair, intelligent, and strong, a leader who had earned his position rather than simply inherited it. But respect was not the same as kindness, and leadership was not the same as love. She had no idea what kind of man she was truly being handed to. Word of the engagement spread quickly through both family circles, and within days, it had become the subject of gossip across the wider pack community. People speculated about why Damien Cross, a man who had avoided marriage for years despite countless introductions, had suddenly agreed to wed the daughter of a struggling merchant family. Some assumed it was simply politics, a strategic move to strengthen alliances and secure resources. Others whispered that there must be more to the story, though none of them could guess just how much more. Among those who whispered the loudest were a small group of pack elders who had long harbored suspicions about their future leader. They had noticed things over the years. The way Damien never seemed interested in the women introduced to him, the closeness between him and Ronan that some found difficult to explain away as simple friendship. They kept these observations mostly to themselves, unwilling to accuse a man as powerful and respected as Damien Cross without proof, but the engagement gave them something new to watch closely. If this marriage was as arranged and hollow as it appeared, they intended to find out why. Ronan, for his part, received the news of the engagement with a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. He had always known this day might come. He had watched Damien delay it for years, had watched him grow more tired and more burdened with each passing season, and had quietly hoped, foolishly perhaps, that somehow it would never actually happen. When Damien finally told him, standing in the same study where the letter had first arrived, Ronan simply nodded and said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say that would change anything. Their bond, whatever it was, however deep it ran, could never be spoken of openly. It could never compete with duty, with legacy, with the survival of an entire pack. Ronan understood this better than anyone, because he had accepted it long before Damien had. He had built his entire life around loving a man he could never fully have, and he was not about to let bitterness poison the only relationship that mattered to him, even if it was about to change forever. As the wedding date drew closer, Elena found herself pulled into a whirlwind of preparation she had no interest in. Dress fittings, guest lists, seating arrangements, all handled by people who seemed far more invested in the event than she was. She moved through it all like a passenger in her own life, offering polite nods and quiet agreement, while inside, a quiet storm of fear and resentment continued to build. She thought often about the man she was about to marry. She wondered what he looked like beyond the formal portrait that had been sent to her family, a stiff, unsmiling image that told her nothing about who he truly was. She wondered if he was cruel or kind, cold or simply reserved. She wondered, most of all, if there was any chance at all that this arranged nightmare could somehow become something bearable. She had no way of knowing that Damien was asking himself the very same questions about her, sitting alone in his study late at night, staring at her portrait, wondering what kind of woman would be forced to spend her life bound to a secret she knew nothing about. He felt guilt, sharp and constant, knowing that whatever pain this arrangement caused him, it would cause her pain as well, pain she had never asked for and did not deserve. Neither of them could have predicted that in the weeks to come, that guilt and fear would slowly transform into something else entirely. Neither of them could have predicted that the wedding night everyone expected to be ordinary, or perhaps painfully awkward, would instead become the moment that changed the direction of both their lives forever. But that moment was still weeks away. For now, there was only the letter, the arrangement, and two strangers preparing to marry, each carrying a secret heavy enough to change everything, neither one aware of how much they truly had in common. As the final week before the wedding approached, tension began to build inside both households in ways that were impossible to ignore. Elena's father grew increasingly anxious, watching every detail of the preparations, as though a single mistake might cause the entire arrangement to collapse and the debt to return in full force. He checked and rechecked the guest list, the contracts, the formal agreements exchanged between the two families, terrified that somewhere in the fine print lay a trap that could still ruin them. Damien, meanwhile, threw himself into pack duties with even greater intensity than before, using work as a shield against his own thoughts. He settled disputes between rival territories, reviewed security arrangements for the upcoming ceremony, and spent long hours in meetings that required little emotional investment, simply because emotional investment was the one thing he could no longer afford to give freely. Ronan watched all of this from a careful distance, saying little, offering support in the quiet, practical ways he always had. He made sure Damien ate when he forgot to. He made sure important messages were delivered on time when Damien's focus wavered. He never once asked Damien to change his decision, and he never once suggested that things could be different. He simply stayed, as he always had, steady and unshaken, even as his own heart carried a weight no one else could see. Elena, in the final days before the wedding, found herself drawn to her late mother's old belongings, searching through boxes she had not opened in years. She found letters her mother had written to her father during their own courtship, letters filled with warmth and affection that felt impossibly distant from the cold arrangement Elena now faced. She read them late at night, tears slipping down her cheeks, mourning not just her mother, but the kind of love she had once believed she would someday find for herself. She did not know that on the other side of the region, in a quiet garden behind the Cross estate, Damien was having a similar moment of his own. He sat beside Ronan under the evening sky, neither of them speaking for a long while, until Damien finally broke the silence with words he had been holding back for weeks. He told Ronan that he was afraid, not of the marriage itself, but of losing the last honest part of his life. He told him that no matter what happened after the wedding, nothing between them needed to change, even if everything around them was about to. Ronan listened, and though his own heart ached with things he could never say, he offered Damien the only comfort he could. He promised he would always be there, whatever form that presence needed to take. It was not the declaration either of them truly wanted, but it was honest, and in a world built on carefully maintained appearances, honesty between the two of them had become its own quiet form of love. As the sun set on the final night before the wedding, both Elena and Damien found themselves standing alone at their windows, staring out at a sky neither of them felt ready to face tomorrow under. Neither knew the other was doing the exact same thing. Neither knew how similar their fears truly were. Tomorrow, two strangers, carrying secrets heavier than anyone around them, realized would stand before their families and the entire pack, and promised to spend the rest of their lives together. Neither of them could have imagined that this forced arrangement, born out of debt and duty and fear, was about to become the beginning of something far more complicated, far more surprising, and far more important than either of them had ever expected. The morning of the final preparations arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over both households like fog rolling in from the hills. Elena woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer, and spent an hour simply sitting at the edge of her bed, staring at the wedding dress hanging on her closet door. It was beautiful, elegant, exactly the kind of dress she might have chosen for herself under different circumstances, and yet looking at it now filled her with nothing but dread. She thought about running. The thought crossed her mind more than once in those final days, wild and impractical as it was. She had no money of her own, no connections beyond her family's crumbling estate, and nowhere to go that would not eventually be found. Running would not save her. It would only delay the inevitable, while destroying whatever fragile trust remained between her and her father. And worse, it would leave her family exposed to the very danger this marriage was meant to prevent. So she stayed, and she prepared, and she told herself over and over that survival sometimes required sacrifice, that countless women before her had faced arranged marriages and found some way to build a life within them. She did not yet know how true, and how strange, that thought would turn out to be. Damien spent his final day before the wedding in much the same state of quiet resignation. He reviewed the ceremony arrangements one last time with the pack's senior advisors, nodding along to details he barely absorbed, his mind elsewhere entirely. When the meetings finally ended, he retreated to the training yard, the same place where, over a decade earlier, he had first realized the truth about himself while watching Ronan spar with another young pack member. He stood there now, alone, running through old exercises, simply to keep his body moving and his mind from spiraling further into fear. Ronan found him there as the sun began to set, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. They simply stood together in comfortable silence, two men who understood each other in ways that required no words, until Damien finally admitted, quietly, that he did not know how he was going to survive being married to a woman he could never truly love. Ronan's answer surprised him. He suggested, gently, that perhaps Damien did not need to love her the way a husband was expected to love a wife. Perhaps, instead, he could find a way to be honest with her, even if it meant taking a risk neither of their families would approve of. Perhaps Elena Voss, forced into this marriage just as unwillingly as Damien had been, deserved better than a lifetime of lies standing between them. Damien considered this for a long time after Ronan left that evening. He thought about the portrait of Elena he kept in his study, the stiff, unsmiling image that told him nothing real about who she was. He thought about the letters his father had exchanged with her family, cold and transactional, containing no mention of her feelings, her dreams, or her fears. He wondered, for the first time, if perhaps she was suffering just as much as he was, trapped by circumstances entirely outside her control. By the time night fell over the Cross estate, Damien had made a decision he had not expected to make. He would not spend his wedding night pretending. He would not force Elena to endure a lifetime of confusion and hidden distance without understanding why. Whatever risk it carried, whatever consequences it might bring, he decided that on their wedding night, he would tell her the truth. He had no way of knowing that, across the region, Elena was making a similar decision of her own, staring at her mother's old letters, and promising herself that she would not spend her marriage pretending to be someone she was not either. She thought of Julian, the man she had loved in secret for over a year before the engagement was announced, a man her family would never have approved of, and she wondered if honesty, however dangerous, was the only way she could survive what was coming. Neither of them knew, as they finally drifted off to sleep on the eve of their wedding, just how close their secrets truly were, or how much closer that honesty was about to bring them. The engagement announcement traveled through the pack faster than either family had expected. Within a single day, it seemed every household connected to the Cross and Voss names had heard the news, and reactions ranged from genuine surprise to quiet, calculated interest. For years, Damien Cross had been considered the most eligible and least attainable bachelor in the region, a man who deflected every attempt at courtship with polite but firm distance. His sudden engagement to a woman from a struggling merchant family raised more questions than it answered, and those questions traveled from kitchen tables to formal gatherings within days. Elena felt the weight of this attention the very first time she stepped outside her family estate after the announcement. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged her in years suddenly greeted her warmly, their eyes lingering a little too long, searching her face for some sign of what she truly felt. Shopkeepers in the nearby village whispered as she passed, and though she could not always hear the words, she understood the tone well enough. She had become a subject of fascination overnight, a curiosity rather than a person, and it made her feel smaller and more alone than she had felt in years. Her father, oblivious to how deeply this attention affected her, seemed almost relieved by the public reaction. To him, every curious glance and whispered conversation was proof that the arrangement was working exactly as intended, restoring the Voss family's standing in the eyes of the community. He began speaking of the wedding with a lightness Elena had not heard from him in months, as though the crushing weight of debt had already lifted from his shoulders entirely. Elena did not have the heart to tell him that her own weight had only grown heavier. Damien faced a different kind of scrutiny within his own pack. His father, Alistair Cross, seemed pleased by the engagement in a way that unsettled Damien more than it comforted him. For the first time in years, Alistair spoke to his son with something resembling warmth, praising his decision, calling it proof that Damien was finally ready to take his place as the pack's next true leader. Damien accepted the praise with a tight smile, knowing that it was built on a foundation his father did not fully understand. The pack elders, meanwhile, watched with a more guarded interest. A small group of them, led by an older woman named Priya who had served as an advisor to the Cross family for decades, met privately to discuss the engagement in the days following its announcement. Priya had long harbored quiet suspicions about Damien, suspicions she had never voiced aloud out of respect for his position and his father's authority. But the sudden nature of this engagement, arranged so quickly and with so little of the courtship one might expect from a man in his position, struck her as unusual enough to warrant careful observation. She said nothing publicly. She simply watched, taking note of small details others might overlook. The way Damien's expression remained carefully neutral whenever Elena's name was mentioned. The way Ronan seemed to remain closer to Damien than ever during this period, rather than stepping back to allow the new bride her rightful place. Priya kept these observations to herself for now, but she did not forget them. Meanwhile, arrangements for the first formal meeting between Elena and Damien were finalized. Tradition demanded that the couple meet at least once, publicly, before their wedding day. A dinner hosted at the Cross estate meant to demonstrate unity between the two families before the entire pack community. Elena dreaded the event more than almost anything else in the weeks leading up to the wedding. She had grown used to imagining Damien only as an idea, a name attached to a stiff portrait. The thought of finally facing him as a real person, with real expressions and a real voice, filled her with a nervous energy she could not quite explain. On the evening of the dinner, Elena dressed carefully, in a deep green gown her father had commissioned specifically for the occasion. She stood in front of her mirror for a long time before leaving, studying her own reflection, trying to find some version of calm confidence to carry into the evening. She reminded herself, as she had reminded herself countless times over the past weeks, that this dinner did not decide her fate. Her fate had already been decided. This dinner was simply the beginning of living with it. The Cross estate, when she arrived, was even grander than she had imagined. Tall stone walls surrounded manicured gardens, and the main hall glowed with warm light spilling from tall windows. Servants guided her and her father through wide corridors, lined with portraits of cross ancestors, each one watching her pass with painted, unreadable expressions. Elena felt smaller with every step, increasingly aware of just how far removed this world was from the modest comfort of her own family home. She was led into a private dining room, where Alistair Cross waited to greet them, along with several senior pack members, including Priya, who studied Elena with a polite but searching gaze. Elena returned the greeting with practiced grace, years of her mother's careful teaching guiding her through the formalities, even as her heart pounded harder with every passing second. Then Damien entered the room. Elena's first impression of him was not what she had expected. The portrait she had studied for weeks had shown a stern, unsmiling man, but the man who walked into the room carried himself with a quiet, controlled composure that felt far more human than that formal image had suggested. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp, thoughtful eyes that swept the room once before settling on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, two strangers about to be bound together for the rest of their lives, searching each other's faces for something neither could name. Damien stepped forward first, offering a polite greeting and a small, respectful bow of his head. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured, carrying none of the coldness Elena had feared. She responded in kind, and for the first time since the engagement had been announced, she felt a small flicker of something other than dread, curiosity perhaps, or simply relief that he did not seem cruel. Dinner proceeded with careful conversation, guided mostly by Alistair Cross, who spoke at length about pack matters and family history, clearly eager to fill any silence that might otherwise grow uncomfortable between the two young people at the center of the arrangement. Elena answered questions politely when asked, offering brief details about her own life, her interests in literature, her quiet dream of one day running a small bookshop, though she said little of the debt or the desperation that had led her here. Damien listened more than he spoke, and Elena noticed this about him almost immediately. When she mentioned her love of books, something shifted subtly in his expression, a flicker of genuine interest breaking through his careful composure. He asked her, quietly, what kind of stories she loved most, and for a brief moment, the dinner table faded into the background, and it was simply the two of them, speaking as two people might speak when they were not bound by duty or fear. It did not last. Alistair redirected the conversation soon after, and the formal atmosphere returned, but Elena found herself thinking about that brief exchange long after the dinner ended. There had been something genuine in it, something that did not match the cold, transactional nature of everything else surrounding their engagement. Damien, for his part, left the dinner with a similar sense of unexpected surprise. He had imagined Elena as simply another piece in a political arrangement, a woman he would need to manage carefully to maintain appearances. Instead, he found himself intrigued by her sharp wit, the quiet strength beneath her polite exterior, and the way she had refused to be intimidated by the grandeur of his family's estate, or the weight of the elders' watchful eyes. Ronan noticed the change in Damien immediately when they spoke privately later that night. Damien did not say much, only that Elena was not what he had expected, that there seemed to be more to her than the desperate circumstances of her family's debt suggested. Ronan listened carefully, and though a small, quiet ache settled in his chest at the thought of Damien growing closer to anyone, even in friendship, he said nothing to discourage it. He wanted, more than anything, for Damien to find some form of peace within this arrangement, even if that peace could never fully include him. Elena, meanwhile, confided in no one about the strange mixture of emotions the dinner had stirred within her. She returned home that night and sat by her window as she often did, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought about Damien's careful, measured way of speaking, the genuine curiosity in his eyes when she spoke of books, the surprising warmth beneath his formal exterior. She reminded herself, firmly, not to read too much into a single dinner. Whatever kindness he had shown tonight did not erase the reality of their situation. He was still a stranger. She was still being forced into this marriage against her will. And somewhere within him, she sensed, though she could not yet explain why, there was something he was not telling her. The feeling stayed with her in the days that followed, a quiet, persistent instinct that something important remained hidden beneath the surface of their arrangement. She noticed it in small things, the way certain pack members exchanged glances whenever Damien's engagement was mentioned. The way Ronan seemed to remain unusually close to Damien, present at nearly every event, watching over him with an intensity that seemed to go beyond simple loyalty. She could not name what she was sensing, but she trusted her instincts enough to know that there was more to her future husband than anyone had told her. She had no way of knowing, not yet, just how right she truly was, or how much that hidden truth would soon change everything between them. In the weeks following the dinner, life for both Elena and Damien settled into an uneasy rhythm of preparation and quiet observation. They saw each other twice more before the wedding, both times at formal gatherings arranged to satisfy tradition, and both times Elena left with the same lingering sense that something important remained unspoken between them. She could not explain the feeling to anyone, not even to herself in any clear way, but it followed her through every fitting, every rehearsal, every polite exchange of letters that passed between their two households in the final stretch before the ceremony. Damien, for his part, grew increasingly aware of how much he had begun to think about Elena outside the required meetings. He found himself wondering what she was doing on quiet afternoons, whether she had found any peace in the chaos of wedding preparations, whether she resented him as much as he feared she might. He told himself these thoughts were simply guilt, a natural response to knowing he was about to trap another person inside a marriage built on a foundation she did not fully understand. But some nights, lying awake in his room, he wondered if it was something more than guilt. He did not allow himself to explore that thought for long. The pack elders, meanwhile, continued their quiet observations. Priya, in particular, made a habit of positioning herself near Damien and Elena whenever they appeared together in public, watching the space between them with careful attention. She noticed the way Damien remained polite but reserved, never once reaching for Elena's hand unless tradition demanded it, never once offering the small, affectionate gestures she had seen in other engaged couples over her many years of service to the pack. She noticed, too, the way Elena's eyes sometimes drifted toward Ronan during these gatherings, as though searching for answers written somewhere in the space between the two men. Priya kept her observations private for now, sharing them with no one, not even the other elders who had joined her earlier conversations. She was a patient woman, and patience, she had learned over decades of service, often revealed truths that impatience could never uncover. Meanwhile, Elena's own private world grew more complicated as the wedding date approached. She received a letter one afternoon, delivered quietly by a family servant who had once helped arrange secret meetings between Elena and a young man named Julian, the very man Elena had loved before her engagement to Damien had been announced. The letter was brief, careful in its wording, as though Julian feared it might be intercepted before reaching her. He wrote that he had heard of her engagement, that his heart ached knowing she was being forced into a marriage she never wanted, and that he would wait for her, no matter how long it took, no matter what the future held. Elena read the letter 3 times, before folding it carefully and hiding it among her mother's old belongings, the same box where she had found the love letters that had brought her so much comfort and grief, in equal measure. She did not respond to Julian's letter. She could not risk it, not with the wedding so close, not with her family's safety hanging in the balance. But she kept the letter close, a quiet reminder that somewhere beyond the walls of this arrangement, someone still loved her for who she truly was. She thought of Julian often in the days that followed, comparing the warmth of his letters to the careful distance Damien maintained during their meetings. She did not resent Damien for this distance, not exactly. If anything, she found herself curious about it, wondering what kept him so guarded, what silent burden he seemed to carry every time they were together. She began to suspect that whatever secret Damien held, it might not be so different from her own. Perhaps he too carried a love he could not speak of. Perhaps he too was walking toward this marriage with a heart already given to someone else. She did not yet realize how close to the truth that suspicion truly was. As the wedding drew closer, both households became consumed by the final details of the ceremony. Alistair Cross insisted on a lavish celebration, one grand enough to demonstrate the strength and prosperity of the Cross Pack to every rival family and every watching eye across the region. Gerald Voss, though his own resources were limited, contributed what he could, eager to show that his family, despite its struggles, still held its head high. Elena found herself swept into an endless series of fittings and rehearsals, her opinions rarely asked for, her preferences quietly overridden, in favor of tradition and grandeur. She endured it all with a patience that surprised even herself, reminding herself constantly that none of these decisions mattered in the end. What mattered was surviving the day itself, and whatever came after. Damien faced his own mounting pressures during this period. Pack business did not pause simply because a wedding approached, and he found himself balancing security arrangements, diplomatic negotiations with neighboring territories, and the constant demands of his father's expectations, all while trying to prepare himself emotionally for a night he dreaded more than any battle he had ever faced. Ronan remained his steady anchor throughout, though even their friendship began to carry a new kind of tension as the wedding drew near. One evening, only a week before the ceremony, the two men found themselves alone in the training yard, long after the sun had set, the same place where Damien had first realized the truth about his own heart so many years earlier. Ronan broke a long silence by asking Damien, quietly, if he had made any decision about what he planned to tell Elena on their wedding night. Damien admitted that he had not changed his mind. He still intended to be honest with her, to give her the truth, rather than force her to spend a lifetime married to a man who could never truly love her the way a husband should. Ronan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that decision, understanding too the risk it carried. If Elena reacted poorly, if she chose to expose the truth out of anger or hurt, everything Damien had built could collapse overnight. But Ronan also understood something else, something he had come to accept over the years of loving Damien from a careful distance. He understood that Damien deserved, at the very least, one relationship in his life, built on honesty rather than performance. If that honesty could not exist between the two of them in the way Ronan had once hoped, perhaps it could exist between Damien and the woman he was about to marry. Perhaps, in its own strange way, that honesty could become its own form of freedom for both of them. Elena, meanwhile, spent her final week before the wedding, trying to prepare herself emotionally for whatever lay ahead. She spoke often with her old family servant, a kind older woman named Margaret, who had helped raise her since childhood, and who remained one of the few people Elena trusted completely. Margaret listened patiently to Elena's fears, offering what comfort she could, though even she had no way of knowing the true nature of what Elena was walking into. One evening, only days before the wedding, Elena asked Margaret directly if she believed people could build happiness within a marriage they never chose for themselves. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering, telling Elena that happiness rarely arrived in the form people expected, and that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances led to the most meaningful connections. She reminded Elena that she was strong, resourceful, and far more capable of shaping her own future than she currently believed, even within the confines of this arrangement. Elena held on to those words in the days that followed, repeating them to herself whenever her fear threatened to overwhelm her. She did not know exactly what shape her future would take, but she began to allow herself a small, cautious hope that perhaps it would not be as bleak as she had once feared. 3 days before the wedding, tradition demanded a formal gathering between the two families to finalize the last details of the ceremony and exchange final blessings. Elena arrived at the Cross estate once again, this time accompanied by a growing sense of familiarity, rather than the overwhelming dread she had felt during her first visit. She greeted Alistair Cross with practiced grace, exchanged polite words with several senior pack members, and finally found herself standing near Damien once again, the two of them momentarily separated from the rest of the gathering by the natural flow of the crowd. Damien took the opportunity to speak with her privately for the first time since their initial dinner. He asked her, quietly, how she was feeling as the wedding approached, and something in his tone told Elena that he genuinely wanted to know the answer, rather than simply performing polite conversation for the benefit of watching eyes. She admitted, cautiously, that she was frightened, though she tried to explain that her fear was not about him specifically, but about the enormity of everything changing so quickly, so completely, without her consent. Damien listened carefully, and when she finished speaking, he offered her something she had not expected. He told her, quietly, that whatever fears she carried into this marriage, he hoped she would trust that he did not intend to make her life harder than it needed to be. He told her that he understood, more than she might realize, what it felt like to have your life's direction decided by forces beyond your control. Elena studied his face carefully as he spoke, searching for the hidden meaning she sensed beneath his words. She did not yet understand exactly what he meant, but something in his tone, some quiet vulnerability breaking through his usual composure, told her that his words carried more weight than a simple attempt at comfort. She thanked him, and for a brief moment, standing together in the crowded hall, surrounded by the noise of wedding preparations swirling around them, the two of them shared a rare moment of genuine connection. Two people bound by circumstance beginning, however cautiously, to see each other as something more than strangers. That night, Elena returned home, and found herself unable to sleep, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. She thought about Damien's words, the careful way he had chosen them, the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior. She thought, too, about Julian's letter still hidden among her mother's belongings, and felt a fresh wave of guilt at how much her feelings toward her future husband seemed to be shifting, even as her heart remained tied to someone else entirely. She did not yet understand the true nature of the secret Damien carried, but she was beginning to sense, with growing certainty, that whatever it was, it would change everything about how she understood their marriage. 2 days before the wedding, Alistair Cross summoned Damien for a private conversation that left the younger man more shaken than he expected. His father spoke at length about legacy, about the importance of producing an heir, about the responsibilities that came with leading one of the most powerful packs in the region. He spoke of Elena as though she were simply a tool for securing the family's future, rather than a person with her own fears and dreams. And Damien found himself struggling to hide his discomfort as his father continued. Toward the end of the conversation, Alistair paused and studied his son carefully, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. He told Damien, in a tone that carried more warning than warmth, that he expected this marriage to succeed in every sense of the word, that he would not tolerate any embarrassment or scandal that might weaken the pack's standing among its rivals. Damien understood exactly what his father meant, even though the words remained carefully vague, and the weight of that warning settled heavily in his chest as he left his father's study that evening. He found Ronan waiting for him outside, as he so often did, and the two of them walked together in silence through the quiet grounds of the estate. Damien finally spoke, admitting that his father's words had frightened him more than he expected, that the pressure to maintain appearances felt heavier now than it ever had before. Ronan listened, offering the same steady presence he always had, though privately, he felt a growing unease of his own, sensing that the wedding, now only 2 days away, was about to test all of them in ways none of them could fully prepare for. Neither of them could have predicted just how dramatically that test would unfold, or how the truths about to be revealed would reshape not just Damien and Elena's future, but the future of the entire pack that depended on them. The final 2 days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and quiet dread for both households. Rumors continued to spread throughout the wider pack community, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed the marriage was purely political, arranged to strengthen border territories against rival packs. Others whispered that Damien had finally fallen for a woman worthy of his attention after years of refusing every match offered to him. A smaller group, quieter and more careful with their words, continued to wonder if there was something else entirely behind the sudden engagement, something none of them had yet managed to uncover. Priya remained at the center of this quieter group, her suspicions sharpening with every public appearance the couple made together. She noticed, during the final formal gathering before the wedding, that Damien's hand rested against Elena's back only when tradition absolutely required it, and that the moment such gestures were no longer necessary, the small distance between them returned immediately. She noticed, too, that Ronan seemed unusually present throughout every stage of the wedding preparations, far more involved than a second-in-command typically would be in matters of his alpha's personal life. She said nothing of these observations to anyone outside her small circle of trusted advisors, but she began quietly preparing herself for the possibility that the wedding might reveal more than anyone currently expected. Elena spent much of her final 2 days of freedom in quiet reflection, walking the familiar paths of her family's modest estate one last time, memorizing details she feared she might lose once she moved permanently into the grandeur of the Cross household. She visited her mother's grave on the final evening before the wedding, sitting quietly beside the simple stone marker for nearly an hour, speaking softly about everything that had happened since her mother's passing. She spoke of her fear, her uncertainty, and the strange, cautious hope that had begun to grow despite everything working against it. She left the grave that evening feeling steadier than she had in weeks, though she could not fully explain why. Perhaps it was simply the release of finally voicing her fears aloud, even to someone who could no longer answer her. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some quiet instinct telling her that whatever waited for her at the end of this arranged path might not be the disaster she had once feared. Damien spent his final evening of freedom in a similar state of quiet reflection, though his thoughts carried a different kind of weight. He reviewed, one final time, exactly what he intended to say to Elena once they were finally alone as husband and wife. He rehearsed the words carefully in his mind, knowing that once spoken, they could never be taken back. He thought of every possible reaction she might have, from anger to disgust to quiet acceptance, and forced himself to prepare for each one, though nothing could truly prepare him for a moment this significant. Ronan found him standing alone in the garden late that night, staring up at the same stars Elena had gazed at from her own window many nights before. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Ronan finally broke the silence, telling Damien simply that whatever happened tomorrow, whatever Elena's reaction turned out to be, he would not face it alone. Damien turned to look at him, and for a brief, unguarded moment, something passed between them that neither dared to name aloud. Then Damien nodded, thanked him quietly, and the two of them stood together in comfortable silence until the night grew too cold to remain outside any longer. The morning of the wedding arrived with a bright, cloudless sky that felt almost cruel in its cheerfulness, given the storm of emotions building beneath the surface of both households. Elena woke early, her stomach twisted with nerves so intense she could barely eat the small breakfast Margaret brought to her room. She allowed herself to be dressed and prepared by a team of attendants, standing still as instructed, her mind drifting somewhere far beyond the room as they worked. By the time she finally stood in front of the mirror, fully dressed in the elegant gown that had been prepared for months, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked composed, elegant, every inch the bride the occasion demanded, though inside, she felt anything but composed. She took a deep breath, reminded herself of her mother's old letters, of Margaret's steady encouragement, of the small, unexpected warmth she had glimpsed in Damien during their final private conversation, and allowed herself one final moment of quiet courage before stepping out to face the day ahead. Damien, meanwhile, prepared for the ceremony with the same careful discipline he brought to every important pack event, though his hands trembled slightly as he dressed, a rare display of nerves from a man known throughout the pack for his steady composure. Ronan helped him prepare, adjusting the formal attire with quiet efficiency, saying little, though his presence alone offered Damien more comfort than words ever could have. As the hour of the ceremony approached, both Elena and Damien found themselves standing at opposite ends of the grand hall prepared for the wedding, separated by rows of gathered guests, pack members and family, all waiting to witness the joining of two powerful families. Neither of them could see the other yet, but both felt the same overwhelming awareness that within hours, their lives would be irrevocably changed, bound together by a ceremony neither had chosen for themselves, yet both had, in their own quiet ways, begun to accept with something other than pure dread. Whatever waited for them beyond the ceremony, whatever truths remained to be spoken once they were finally alone, neither of them could have imagined just how significant this day would become, not just for themselves, but for everyone connected to the powerful and closely watched Cross Pack. The grand hall of the Cross estate had been transformed overnight into something that looked almost otherworldly. Tall white flowers lined every column, their soft fragrance mixing with the scent of polished wood and candle smoke. Long tables stretched along the edges of the room, already set for the celebration that would follow the ceremony, while rows of chairs filled the center, reserved for the hundreds of guests who had traveled from across the region to witness the union of the Cross and Voss families. Elena stood just outside the tall double doors leading into the hall, her father beside her, his arm offered for her to take. She could hear the low murmur of the gathered crowd beyond the doors, a sound that made her stomach tighten with every passing second. Gerald Voss looked at his daughter with an expression she had not seen from him in years, something caught between pride and guilt, as though even now, on the final morning of this arrangement he had orchestrated, some part of him understood the weight of what he had asked her to sacrifice. He spoke to her quietly before the doors opened, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He told her that he knew this was not the life she had dreamed of, that he understood if she never fully forgave him for the choice he had made on her behalf. But he also told her that he believed, despite everything, that she was strong enough to build something meaningful from whatever circumstances life placed in front of her. Elena listened to his words in silence, feeling the familiar mixture of resentment and love that had defined her relationship with her father throughout this entire ordeal. She squeezed his arm gently, a small gesture of forgiveness she was not yet ready to put into words, and nodded toward the doors. Inside the hall, Damien stood at the front, waiting beside Ronan, who remained close as always, a steady presence, meant to offer quiet support, even as tradition demanded he step back once the ceremony formally began. Alistair Cross sat in the front row, his expression carrying the satisfied pride of a father watching years of careful planning finally reach fruition. Beside him, Priya sat with her usual composed expression, though her eyes remained sharp, watching every detail unfold with the careful attention of someone determined not to miss a single revealing moment. When the doors finally opened and Elena stepped into view, a soft murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. She looked breathtaking in her gown, composed and graceful despite the storm of emotions she carried beneath the surface. Damien watched her walk slowly down the aisle toward him, and for a brief moment, the noise of the crowd, the weight of his father's expectations, and the fear that had consumed him for weeks, all faded into the background. He found himself focusing entirely on her, on the quiet strength in her expression, on the way she held herself, with a dignity that suggested far more courage than fear. When she finally reached the front of the hall and took her place beside him, their eyes met for a long moment before the ceremony officially began. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in that silent exchange, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would face it together, even if neither fully understood yet what that would mean. The ceremony itself proceeded exactly as tradition demanded, filled with formal blessings from pack elders, solemn vows exchanged before the gathered crowd, and the symbolic joining of both families through carefully worded declarations meant to bind their futures together. Elena spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, surprising herself with how composed she managed to sound, despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. Damien's voice, too, remained steady throughout, though those who knew him best, particularly Ronan, could hear the slight tension threaded through his careful words. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, a wave of applause and cheering erupted through the hall, and for the first time since the engagement had been announced, Elena allowed herself to smile, not out of genuine happiness, but out of sheer relief that the most difficult part of the day had finally passed. Damien offered her a small, genuine smile of his own, and in that brief exchange, something quietly shifted between them, a fragile but real sense of partnership beginning to take root where fear and obligation had once stood alone. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music, dancing, and endless rounds of formal congratulations from guests eager to align themselves with the newly strengthened alliance between the Cross and Voss families. Elena found herself swept from conversation to conversation, offering polite smiles and gracious thanks to people she had never met before, and would likely never see again beyond formal pack gatherings. Damien remained close to her throughout much of the celebration, though the demands of hosting such a significant event pulled him away frequently to greet important guests and accept congratulations from pack allies. During the rare moments they found themselves alone together amid the crowd, their conversation remained light and careful, neither of them quite ready to address the deeper truths that still waited to be spoken once the celebration finally ended. Ronan watched the proceedings from a respectful distance, offering quiet congratulations when appropriate, though the weight of what this day truly meant settled heavily in his chest as the hours passed. He found himself, more than once, catching Damien's eye across the crowded hall, sharing a brief, unspoken exchange that carried more meaning than either of them could express in a room full of watching eyes. As the evening wore on, Priya continued her careful observation, watching the newly married couple interact with a level of attention few others in the room seemed to notice. She observed the way Damien's expression softened only in Elena's presence, yet never carried the warmth she had witnessed in other newly married couples over her many years of service. She observed, too, the quiet, careful way Elena studied her new husband throughout the evening, as though searching for answers to questions she had not yet found the courage to ask directly. By the time the celebration finally began winding down, exhaustion had settled over both Elena and Damien, though neither of them dared show it openly in front of their guests. Tradition demanded that the newly married couple retire together, once the formal celebration concluded, a moment that both of them had been quietly dreading and anticipating in equal measure throughout the entire evening. As the final guests began departing, and the hall slowly emptied of its earlier noise and energy, Elena felt a fresh wave of nervous anticipation settle over her. Whatever waited for her once she and Damien were finally alone together, she knew instinctively that it would shape the entire course of their marriage moving forward. She thought again of the strange, quiet warmth she had witnessed from him throughout their limited interactions, the careful way he seemed to be hiding something significant beneath his composed exterior, and wondered, with growing certainty, if tonight might finally reveal what that something truly was. Damien, watching the final guests depart from across the emptying hall, felt his own resolve solidifying, despite the fear still churning within him. He had made his decision weeks ago, standing in the garden with Ronan beneath a sky full of stars, and he did not intend to let fear change his mind now, not after everything that had led them to this moment. Whatever the consequences, Elena deserved the truth, and tonight, finally, he intended to give it to her. As the last of the guests said their farewells and the grand hall fell into a quiet stillness that felt almost overwhelming after hours of noise and celebration, Elena and Damien found themselves standing together near the entrance, finally alone for the first time since the ceremony had begun that morning. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, both acutely aware that whatever conversation waited ahead of them would determine the entire shape of the life they were now bound to share. Damien finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but steady, suggesting they retire to their private quarters, where they could speak freely, without the risk of being overheard. Elena nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation, and together, husband and wife in name if nothing else, they walked slowly through the quiet corridors of the Cross estate, toward the private wing that would now serve as their shared home. The walk felt longer than it truly was, filled with a silence that carried far more weight than any conversation could have. Elena studied the portraits lining the corridor walls as they passed, ancestors of the family she had now formally joined, their painted eyes seeming to watch her with the same careful curiosity she had felt from the pack elders throughout the entire evening. Damien walked beside her, his expression carefully controlled, though Elena could sense the tension radiating from him with every step they took. When they finally reached the door to their private chambers, Damien paused for a moment before opening it, glancing at Elena with an expression she could not quite read. He asked her, quietly, if she was ready, and though Elena was not entirely certain what he meant by the question, something in his tone told her that whatever waited on the other side of that door would be far more significant than the wedding night she had originally imagined. She nodded, steadying herself with a deep breath, and together, they stepped through the door and into the private space that would now belong to both of them, carrying with them secrets that were, unbeknownst to either of them, about to finally be spoken aloud. The private chamber prepared for them was warm and quiet, lit by soft candlelight that cast gentle shadows across the walls. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the bed had been decorated with flowers, in keeping with tradition, though neither Elena nor Damien paid it much attention as they stepped inside and the heavy door closed behind them, sealing them away from the rest of the estate for the first time, as husband and wife. Elena stood near the center of the room, unsure of what to do with her hands, while Damien remained near the door for a long moment, gathering the courage he had spent weeks preparing. The silence between them stretched long enough that Elena finally spoke first, asking him gently if something was wrong. She had noticed his tension building throughout the evening, and now, alone together, that tension seemed to fill the entire room. Damien took a slow breath and finally crossed the room to sit near her, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to give her space. He told her that before anything else happened tonight, there was something important he needed to tell her, something he should have told her weeks ago, but had been too afraid to say. Elena's heart began to race, uncertain what to expect, though some quiet instinct told her that whatever he was about to reveal would finally explain the careful distance and hidden tension she had sensed in him since the very first dinner they had shared. He told her the truth. He explained, carefully and honestly, that he was gay, that he had known this about himself since he was a teenager, and that he had spent years hiding this truth from everyone, except one person he trusted completely. He told her about the pressure from his father, about the pack elders, who would never accept a leader whose truth did not align with their expectations, about the fear that had driven him to agree to this marriage in the first place, believing it was the only way to protect both his position and his family's legacy, while continuing to hide who he truly was. He told her, finally, that this marriage had never been meant to be a real one, not in the way marriages were typically understood. He had intended, from the very beginning, for it to remain a partnership in name only, a shield against suspicion, rather than a true union between husband and wife. He apologized for not telling her sooner, for allowing her to walk into this marriage without understanding the full truth of what she was agreeing to. Elena sat in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking, processing everything he had just revealed. She had suspected something significant was being hidden from her, but she had not imagined anything quite like this. Slowly, as the shock began to settle, something unexpected happened. Instead of anger or betrayal, Elena felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of relief, followed almost immediately by empathy for the man sitting beside her, who had clearly carried this burden alone for far too long. She reached out and gently took his hand, surprising them both with the gesture. She told him that she understood, more than he might realize, what it felt like to be forced into a life shaped entirely by other people's expectations. And then, taking a deep breath of her own, she offered him a truth of her own in return. She told him about Julian, about the love she had carried in secret for over a year, a love her family would never have approved of given their circumstances, a love that had been quietly crushed the moment her father announced her engagement to Damien. She told him about the letter Julian had sent her, still hidden among her mother's old belongings, and admitted that she had come into this marriage, carrying her own hidden grief, her own quiet act of sacrifice, that no one around her fully understood. For a long moment, both of them sat in silence, absorbing the weight of everything that had just been shared between them. Then, slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of the awkward tension that might have followed such revelations, a strange sense of relief settled over the room. Neither of them had to pretend anymore. Neither of them had to perform the role of a happily married couple in private, at least not with each other. Damien, after a long silence, finally spoke again, his voice lighter than Elena had heard it since they first met. He suggested, cautiously, that perhaps this marriage did not have to be the trap either of them had feared it would become. Perhaps, instead, it could become something entirely different. A true partnership, built not on romantic love, but on honesty, mutual respect, and shared protection against a world that would never fully understand either of their true hearts. Elena considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the exhaustion and tension of the day. She told him that she liked that idea, that perhaps together they could build a life that allowed both of them, in their own quiet ways, to remain true to themselves, while still fulfilling the obligations that had brought them together in the first place. They spent the rest of that first night not as husband and wife in the traditional sense, but as two people who had finally found, in the most unexpected of circumstances, someone who truly understood the weight of the secrets they carried. They talked long into the night, sharing stories from their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for what their futures might still hold, despite the constraints placed upon them. Elena told him more about her dream of opening a small bookshop someday, and Damien, in turn, spoke more openly than he had in years about the fear and loneliness that had defined so much of his adult life. As the night grew late and exhaustion finally began to overtake them both, Elena found herself feeling something she had not expected to feel on this day of all days. She felt hope. Not the romantic hope she had once imagined for her future, but a quieter, steadier kind of hope, built on the discovery that even a marriage born from debt and desperation could become something meaningful, something built on truth rather than lies. Damien, watching her finally drift toward sleep in the soft candlelight, felt a similar sense of unexpected relief settle over him. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone in carrying the weight of his secret. Whatever challenges still waited for them, whatever dangers their hidden truths might eventually invite, he found himself grateful, in this strange and unexpected way, for the woman now sleeping peacefully beside him, bound to him, not by love in the traditional sense, but by something perhaps even rarer, genuine understanding. Neither of them could have predicted that this quiet, honest wedding night would become the foundation for one of the most unexpected partnerships either of their families had ever witnessed, nor could they have predicted just how much this fragile new understanding, would soon be tested by the very people determined to uncover the truth they had only just begun to share with one another. In the weeks that followed their wedding night, Elena and Damien settled into a routine that surprised everyone around them, including themselves. To the outside world, they appeared to be a devoted young couple, attending pack functions together, sharing meals in the grand dining hall, and presenting a united front whenever official duties required it. Behind closed doors, however, their relationship developed into something entirely different from what either of them had expected, a genuine friendship built on honesty rather than performance. Elena quickly discovered that living within the Cross estate offered her freedoms she had not anticipated. Damien, true to his word, never pressured her to behave as a traditional wife might. He encouraged her interests, listened genuinely when she spoke about the books she loved, and even arranged for a small private study to be set up for her, filled with shelves, that she slowly began to fill with volumes purchased from a bookshop in the nearby village. It was not the bookshop she had once dreamed of owning herself, but it was a start, a small piece of her old dream brought to life within the confines of her new circumstances. Damien, in turn, found himself opening up to Elena in ways he had never expected. He began sharing details of his work leading the pack, explaining the delicate balance of diplomacy and strength required to maintain peace with neighboring territories. Elena listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering insights that surprised him with their sharpness, drawing on her own experience, navigating her family's financial struggles, and the complicated relationships that came with maintaining appearances despite hardship. Their growing friendship did not go unnoticed by those closest to them. Margaret, who had accompanied Elena to her new home as a trusted attendant, quietly observed the shift in her charge's demeanor with quiet relief. Elena seemed lighter than she had in months, laughing more freely, carrying herself with a confidence that had been noticeably absent during the tense weeks leading up to the wedding. Margaret did not know the full truth of the arrangement between Elena and Damien, but she recognized genuine contentment when she saw it, and she was grateful, whatever the reason, that her charge seemed to be finding some measure of peace. Ronan, meanwhile, found himself navigating a complicated set of emotions as he watched Damien's friendship with Elena deepen. He had expected, when Damien first decided to tell Elena the truth, that their relationship would remain strictly practical, a careful alliance built to maintain appearances while changing nothing about his own bond with Damien. Instead, he found himself witnessing something more complex unfold, a genuine warmth developing between husband and wife that, while not romantic, still occupied a significant space in Damien's life that Ronan had never had to share before. He did not resent Elena for this. If anything, he found himself growing to respect her more with each passing week, recognizing the quiet strength and grace with which she had accepted circumstances so completely outside her control. But he could not deny the small ache that settled in his chest whenever he watched Damien laugh freely in her presence, a lightness that Ronan sometimes struggled to draw out himself, burdened as their own relationship was by years of careful secrecy and unspoken longing. It was Elena, surprisingly, who first noticed the tension building within Ronan. She had grown close enough to Damien by this point to feel comfortable asking him directly about his relationship with his second-in-command, and one evening, several weeks after the wedding, she finally worked up the courage to raise the subject during a quiet dinner shared between just the two of them. Damien, caught off guard by her directness, hesitated before answering. He admitted, finally, that his feelings for Ronan ran deeper than simple friendship, that they had cared for each other for years, though circumstances and duty had always kept them from acting on those feelings in any meaningful way. He explained that Ronan had been the one person who knew his truth long before Elena had, the one constant presence who had supported him through every difficult decision he had faced as he prepared to take on leadership of the pack. Elena listened carefully, and rather than feeling threatened or excluded by this revelation, she felt something closer to determination. She told Damien, gently but firmly, that he deserved to find real happiness, not just the quiet contentment of a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect, but genuine love, if such a thing was possible for him, within the constraints of their current circumstances. She suggested, cautiously, that perhaps their unusual marriage could create more space for that kind of happiness than either of them had initially imagined. Damien was quiet for a long time after she spoke, considering her words carefully. He had spent so many years convincing himself that genuine happiness with Ronan was simply impossible, a dream he needed to set aside permanently for the sake of duty and survival. Hearing Elena suggest, so openly and without judgment, that such happiness might still be within reach, stirred something in him he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Hope. In the weeks that followed, with Elena's quiet encouragement, Damien began spending more open time with Ronan, no longer hiding the depth of their bond behind the careful walls he had maintained for so many years. Ronan, initially cautious and uncertain about this shift, slowly allowed himself to hope as well, recognizing in Elena an unexpected ally rather than a rival for Damien's affection. Elena made a point of getting to know Ronan better during this period, inviting him to join her and Damien for meals, engaging him in conversation about pack matters and his own history within the Cross family. She found him to be thoughtful and dedicated, fiercely loyal to Damien in ways that went far beyond simple duty, and she began to understand, more fully than before, just how much he meant to her husband. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the private study Damien had built for Elena, surrounded by the growing collection of books she had gathered over the past weeks, Elena watched quietly as Damien and Ronan fell into easy, comfortable conversation, their years of careful restraint slowly giving way to something more natural and unguarded. She felt a quiet satisfaction at having played some small part in creating space for this connection to breathe more freely, even if only within the private walls of their own home. In turn, Elena found herself confiding more openly in both men about her own hidden heartache. She told them the full story of her relationship with Julian, how they had met at a small gathering hosted by a mutual family friend, how their connection had grown slowly over months of secret meetings and carefully worded letters, and how devastated she had been when her engagement to Damien had forced her to end all contact with him. Damien listened to her story with genuine sympathy, understanding all too well the pain of loving someone you could not openly claim. He asked her, gently, if she still thought about reaching out to Julian, now that their marriage had transformed into something so different from what either of them had originally expected. Elena admitted that she thought about him often, that she still kept his final letter hidden among her mother's belongings, though she had convinced herself that reaching out again would be far too dangerous, risking not just her own reputation, but the fragile peace she and Damien had managed to build together. Ronan, surprising both of them, suggested that perhaps danger was not as absolute as Elena believed. He pointed out that their entire household had already become a place where hidden truths were beginning to find room to breathe more freely. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, there might be a way to reach out to Julian discreetly, to at least let him know that Elena's heart remained unchanged, even if circumstances prevented anything more from developing between them for the time being. Elena considered this possibility for several days before finally deciding to write a careful letter to Julian, using a trusted messenger recommended by Ronan, someone known for discretion within the Pax network. She did not reveal the full truth of her marriage in the letter, only that circumstances had grown more complicated than either of them had anticipated, and that she remained grateful for his patience and continued affection, even as she could not yet offer him any clear promise about their future together. The letter was sent quietly, without Alistair Cross or any of the pack elders aware of its existence, and for a brief period, life within the Cross estate settled into something resembling genuine peace. Elena continued building her small collection of books, occasionally exchanging quiet correspondence with Julian through Ronan's trusted network. Damien and Ronan grew steadily closer, no longer hiding behind the same careful distance that had defined their relationship for years. And though none of them could fully escape the weight of the secrets they still carried, they had, together, created a small sanctuary within the walls of their shared home, where those secrets no longer felt quite so isolating. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. Even as Elena, Damien, and Ronan grew closer within the private walls of the estate, the watchful eyes outside those walls had not stopped searching for answers. Priya's quiet observations continued, and slowly, methodically, she began piecing together a picture that threatened to unravel everything the three of them had so carefully built. None of them yet realized just how close that unraveling truly was, or how quickly the fragile peace they had found would soon be tested by forces far beyond their control. As the weeks turned into months, the quiet suspicions Priya had harbored since the wedding began to solidify into something far more concrete. She was not the only elder watching closely. A small circle of senior pack members, all of them loyal to Alistair Cross and deeply invested in the future stability of the pack, had grown increasingly uneasy about the lack of visible progress in Damien and Elena's marriage. No announcement of an expected heir had come, no public displays of the deepening affection one might expect from a young married couple. Instead, there was only a strange, distant harmony that felt, to those watching closely, more like careful performance than genuine partnership. Priya finally decided to act on her suspicions during a private meeting with two other trusted elders, a stern, older man named Felix, who had served the pack for over 30 years, and a sharp-eyed woman named Nora, who had long been known for her keen ability to notice details others overlooked. The three of them met in a quiet chamber away from the main halls of the estate, speaking in careful, measured tones about everything they had observed since the wedding. Felix voiced the concern most directly, stating plainly that something about Damien's marriage did not align with what a pack in their position needed. He reminded the others that stability required more than the appearance of unity. It required a clear future, a promise of continuation that reassured allies and discouraged rivals from testing the pack's strength during any perceived moment of weakness. Without visible progress toward that future, the entire arrangement risked looking exactly like what Felix now suspected it truly was, a convenient shield rather than a genuine union. Nora added her own observations, describing the closeness she had witnessed between Damien and Ronan during recent gatherings, closeness that seemed to have grown rather than diminished since the wedding, despite tradition suggesting that a newly married man should be drawing closer to his wife, rather than maintaining such an intense bond with another man. She admitted that she had no proof of anything improper, only instinct built on decades of careful observation, but her instinct told her that something significant was being hidden from the wider pack community. Priya listened to both of her colleagues before finally sharing her own growing certainty. She believed, based on everything she had witnessed, that Damien's marriage to Elena was exactly what it appeared to be beneath its carefully maintained surface. A partnership of convenience, built to protect a truth about their future alpha that the pack elders would never willingly accept. She did not yet know the full nature of that truth, but she suspected it involved Ronan far more directly than anyone had previously considered. The three elders debated at length about how to proceed. Some among them argued for confronting Damien directly, demanding answers before the situation grew any more complicated. Others argued for continued patience, suggesting that further observation might reveal more concrete evidence before any accusations were made that could not be walked back. Ultimately, they agreed to continue watching carefully for now, though Priya made it clear that she did not intend to wait indefinitely. If clear answers did not emerge soon, she intended to bring her concerns directly to Alistair Cross himself. Word of these private meetings, though carefully guarded, eventually began to reach other members of the pack community, through the same quiet channels that had spread rumors since the very announcement of Damien and Elena's engagement. Servants who had overheard fragments of conversation shared whispers with other servants. Those whispers reached the ears of minor pack officials, who mentioned them, cautiously, to their own trusted friends. Slowly, steadily, suspicion began to spread beyond the small circle of elders who had first raised it. Elena first became aware that something had shifted when she noticed a change in the way certain pack members interacted with her during a formal gathering held to celebrate the changing of the season, a tradition observed by packs throughout the region. Where once she had received polite, if distant, courtesy from most of the guests, she now sensed a new sharpness in some of the glances directed her way, a curiosity that felt less innocent than before, more calculating in its intensity. She mentioned this observation to Damien later that evening, and his expression grew troubled as she described what she had noticed. He admitted that he too had sensed a shift in recent weeks, subtle comments from certain elders during pack meetings that seemed designed to probe for information rather than simply engage in routine business discussions. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that their careful efforts to maintain appearances would be enough to satisfy the pack's expectations indefinitely, but the growing scrutiny suggested otherwise. Ronan, when informed of these developments, grew visibly concerned in a way that was rare for him. He had spent years perfecting the art of remaining unnoticed, of supporting Damien from a careful distance that avoided drawing unwanted attention. The idea that their bond had become a subject of quiet investigation among the pack elders filled him with a dread he had not felt since the earliest days of hiding his feelings for Damien as a much younger man. The three of them spent long hours discussing how best to respond to this growing threat. Elena suggested that perhaps they needed to make a more visible effort to appear as a traditional couple, at least in public settings, in order to quiet the suspicions building around them. Damien agreed reluctantly, understanding the necessity even as it meant returning, at least temporarily, to a level of performance he had hoped to leave behind after their honest wedding night conversation. Ronan, meanwhile, suggested that he should perhaps step back from his usual closeness with Damien during public gatherings, creating more visible distance that might help ease the elders' concerns. Damien resisted this suggestion at first, unwilling to sacrifice the openness they had only recently begun to enjoy, but eventually, recognizing the very real danger their situation now faced, he agreed that some caution was necessary, at least until the immediate scrutiny began to fade. Despite their best efforts, the increased caution did little to fully satisfy the growing suspicions among the pack elders. Priya, in particular, remained unconvinced by the more visible affection Elena and Damien began displaying during public events, recognizing something performative in gestures that had felt, in her careful observation, notably absent during the earlier months of their marriage. If anything, the sudden shift in behavior only strengthened her conviction that something significant was being deliberately hidden. Matters came to a head several weeks later, during a large gathering held to celebrate an important alliance between the Cross Pack and a neighboring territory. The event drew pack members and dignitaries from across the region, creating exactly the kind of high-pressure environment where careful appearances mattered most, and where even small missteps could draw significant attention. During the celebration, Felix approached Damien directly, engaging him in what began as routine conversation about pack business, before gradually shifting toward more personal questions about his marriage and his plans for the future of his family line. Damien answered carefully, maintaining his composure, despite the pointed nature of the questions, but he could sense, with growing unease, that Felix was testing him, searching for cracks in the careful performance he and Elena had worked so hard to maintain. Across the room, Nora engaged Elena in a similarly probing conversation, asking detailed questions about her relationship with Damien, her hopes for their future together, and subtly, almost imperceptibly, questions designed to gauge whether Elena's affection for her husband carried the genuine warmth one would expect from a woman deeply in love. Elena, drawing on the same careful grace that had guided her through the earliest, most difficult days of the arranged marriage, managed to navigate the conversation without revealing anything that might confirm the elders' growing suspicions. By the end of the evening, both Damien and Elena felt emotionally exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain their careful performance. They returned to their private chambers that night and spoke quietly about the growing pressure surrounding them, both recognizing that the situation had become significantly more precarious than they had initially anticipated. The fragile peace they had built over the past months now felt increasingly threatened by forces neither of them could fully control. Ronan joined them shortly after, having received word that Felix had approached several other pack members that same evening, asking similarly pointed questions about Damien and Ronan's relationship, questions that suggested the elders' suspicions were growing bolder and more direct with each passing week. The three of them sat together late into the night, discussing what options remained available to them, aware that whatever careful balance they had maintained until now was quickly becoming unsustainable. None of them yet knew exactly how or when the growing suspicion surrounding them would finally reach its breaking point, but all three of them sensed, with a heavy certainty that settled over the room like a physical weight, that such a breaking point was drawing steadily closer, and that when it finally arrived, it would test everything they had built together in ways far more significant than anything they had faced before. The breaking point arrived sooner than any of them expected, and it began with a mistake so small that none of them realized its significance until it was too late to undo. A servant, passing through the private wing of the estate late one evening, overheard a fragment of conversation between Damien and Ronan that should never have reached outside ears. It was not a dramatic confession, only a quiet, affectionate exchange between two men who had, in recent weeks, allowed themselves small moments of openness within what they believed was the safety of their own home. But it was enough for a servant loyal to Felix to carry the story directly to him within hours. Felix wasted no time. Rather than approaching Damien directly, he brought the information straight to Alistair Cross, framing it not as gossip, but as a matter of grave concern for the future stability of the pack. Alistair listened to Felix's account with a stillness that unsettled even the older elder, his expression giving away nothing, as Felix described what the servant claimed to have witnessed. That evening, Alistair summoned Damien to his private study, and the moment Damien entered the room and saw his father's expression, he understood immediately that whatever careful balance they had maintained until now had finally collapsed. Alistair did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply repeated, word for word, what Felix had reported to him, watching his son's face carefully for any reaction that might confirm or deny the accusation. Damien stood in silence for a long moment, his mind racing through every possible response, every careful denial he might offer to protect himself and everyone he cared about. But as he looked at his father, a man who had spent his entire life building a legacy he expected his only son to carry forward without question, Damien felt something shift inside him, a weariness, deep and exhausted, born from years of hiding, performing, and denying the most fundamental truth about himself. He told his father the truth. He confirmed that he was gay, that he had known this about himself since he was a teenager, and that his relationship with Ronan, while never openly acknowledged, had shaped the deepest and most meaningful part of his emotional life for over a decade. He explained, as calmly as he could manage despite the storm of fear building inside him, that his marriage to Elena had been built on mutual honesty rather than deception toward her specifically, and that whatever judgment his father wished to pass, it should not extend to punishing her for a truth she had willingly accepted and understood from the very beginning. Alistair sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, processing the confirmation of everything he had spent years refusing to consciously acknowledge, even as quiet doubts had lingered in the back of his mind for longer than he cared to admit. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that, beneath the surface, resembled genuine fear for what this revelation might mean for the future of everything he had built. He reminded Damien, in a tone sharpened by years of pressure and responsibility, exactly what was at stake. The pack's stability depended on strong, unquestioned leadership. Rival territories were always searching for any sign of weakness to exploit, and a truth like this, if it became widely known, could be used against them in ways that threatened not just Damien's position, but the safety and prosperity of every family within the Crosspack's protection. Damien listened to his father's warnings with a heavy heart, understanding the legitimate fears behind them, even as he refused to let those fears erase the truth he had finally found the courage to speak aloud. He told his father that he had spent his entire adult life hiding this part of himself out of exactly the fears his father was now voicing, and that the cost of that hiding had been far greater than his father seemed willing to acknowledge. It had cost him years of loneliness, years of denying himself any genuine happiness, years of watching Ronan sacrifice his own chance at open love, simply to remain quietly by Damien's side. The conversation stretched long into the night, filled with anger, hurt, and difficult truths neither father nor son had ever dared speak aloud before. Alistair demanded to know what Damien intended to do now that the truth had come to light, whether he intended to continue hiding behind his marriage to Elena, or whether he expected the pack to simply accept a truth that threatened everything Alistair had spent his life building. Damien, drawing on a courage he had not known he possessed until this very moment, told his father that he did not intend to hide any longer. He intended to speak the truth openly, to the elders, to the wider pack community if necessary, trusting that the loyalty he had earned through years of fair and capable leadership would ultimately matter more than the prejudice of those unwilling to accept him for who he truly was. Alistair left the study that night without offering his son any promise of support, his expression carrying a heavy uncertainty that Damien had never witnessed from his father before. Whatever happened next, Damien understood that he had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed, and he returned to his private chambers that evening, carrying both fear and an unexpected sense of relief that came from finally, after so many years, allowing his truth to exist openly in the world. Elena and Ronan were waiting for him when he returned, having already sensed, through the tense atmosphere that had settled over the estate that evening, that something significant had occurred. Damien told them everything, watching their expressions carefully, as he explained his father's reaction and his own decision to speak the truth openly, rather than continue hiding. Elena reached for his hand immediately, offering steady reassurance despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She told him that she stood beside him completely, that whatever consequences arose from this revelation, she would face them with him, rather than allow him to carry this burden alone. Ronan, though visibly shaken by the sudden exposure of a truth he had guarded so carefully for so many years, echoed her sentiment, telling Damien that he too was finally ready to stop hiding, whatever the cost. Word of Damien's confession to his father spread through the pack's inner circles with startling speed over the following days. Some reacted with the harsh judgment Alistair had feared, whispering that a leader who could not fulfill the traditional expectations of marriage and lineage had no place guiding the future of their pack. Others, surprisingly, reacted with a more measured curiosity, recalling years of fair leadership, careful diplomacy, and genuine care that Damien had consistently demonstrated throughout his time serving alongside his father. Priya, upon learning that her suspicions had finally been confirmed, found herself surprised by her own reaction. Rather than the satisfaction she might have expected from having her careful observations validated, she felt a quiet, unexpected sympathy for the young alpha she had spent months investigating. She had served the Crosspack for decades, long enough to recognize genuine capability and dedication when she saw it, and she found herself, despite years of quiet suspicion, unwilling to simply dismiss Damien's worth as a leader, based solely on this newly revealed truth. She requested a private meeting with Damien, Elena, and Ronan together, wanting to understand the full truth of their situation, before deciding how she intended to proceed. The four of them met in the same quiet chamber where Priya had first voiced her suspicions to Felix and Nora, and this time, Damien, Elena, and Ronan spoke openly, explaining everything from the beginning. The arranged marriage born from debt and duty. The honest wedding night confession that had transformed a forced arrangement into genuine friendship. The years of hidden love between Damien and Ronan that had shaped so much of Damien's careful, guarded life. Priya listened to their entire story in thoughtful silence, and when they finished speaking, she admitted that she had expected to find evidence of deception and betrayal, but instead found something far more complicated. A genuine partnership built on honesty, however unconventional it appeared on the surface. She told them that she could not promise the wider pack elders would react with the same understanding she now felt, but she offered to speak on their behalf, using her decades of respected service to advocate for a more measured, thoughtful response, rather than immediate, harsh judgment. Her support, though not a guarantee of acceptance, offered the first genuine sign of hope Damien, Elena, and Ronan had felt since the truth had first been exposed. Whatever challenges still remained ahead of them, they now understood that not every member of the pack was determined to see them fail. Some, like Priya, seemed willing, at the very least, to listen with open minds before rushing toward judgment. The true test, however, still lay ahead. A formal gathering had already been called by several concerned elders, demanding that Damien address the growing rumors directly before the full pack community, a confrontation that would determine, once and for all, whether the truth Damien had finally found the courage to speak would be met with acceptance, rejection, or something far more complicated than either extreme. The morning of the formal gathering arrived with a tension that seemed to hang over the entire Cross estate, like a storm cloud waiting to break. Word had spread throughout the wider pack community that something significant was about to be addressed, and by the time the appointed hour arrived, the Grand Hall, the very same hall that had hosted Damien and Elena's wedding celebration months earlier, filled with more people than it had seen since that day. Pack members from every corner of the territory gathered, curious and uncertain about what they were about to witness. Elena stood beside Damien near the front of the hall, her hand resting steadily in his, refusing to let go despite the nervous energy radiating from him. Ronan stood close by as well, no longer hidden at a careful distance, his presence beside Damien deliberate and unashamed for the first time in front of such a large gathering. Alistair Cross sat in his customary place among the elders, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his posture suggested he remained deeply uncertain about how this gathering would unfold. Felix and Nora sat near the front as well, their expressions carrying a mixture of vindication and lingering uncertainty, now that the suspicions they had spent months investigating were finally about to be addressed openly. Priya sat beside them, her expression calm and thoughtful, offering Damien a small reassuring nod as he prepared to step forward and address the gathered crowd. When the hall finally settled into silence, Damien stepped forward, his heart pounding as he faced hundreds of pairs of eyes waiting for him to speak. He began by acknowledging the rumors that had spread throughout the pack in recent weeks, rumors concerning his marriage, his relationship with Ronan, and the true nature of the life he had spent years carefully hiding from public view. He told them that rather than continuing to deny or deflect these questions, he intended to address them honestly, trusting that the pack he had dedicated his entire life to serving deserved nothing less than the truth. He spoke openly, his voice growing steadier with each word, about discovering his own truth as a teenager, about the years of fear that had driven him to hide that truth behind careful performance and dedicated service. He spoke about his marriage to Elena, explaining honestly that it had begun as an arrangement neither of them had chosen, but had transformed, through mutual honesty and respect, into a genuine partnership built on something far more meaningful than the pack had initially expected from them. He turned to look at Elena as he spoke, and she stepped forward to stand beside him, addressing the gathered crowd herself. She told them that she did not regret the choice she had made to build an honest life with Damien, even if that life did not follow the traditional path expected of a married couple. She spoke of the friendship and trust they had built together, a bond that, while different from romantic love, had given both of them something they desperately needed, a place to finally exist without pretense. Ronan stepped forward last, and though his voice carried a visible nervousness, he spoke with a quiet conviction that seemed to steady as he continued. He told the gathered pack members that his bond with Damien had shaped the most meaningful years of his life, that he had spent over a decade willing to remain hidden simply for the chance to remain close to someone he cared for deeply. He said he was no longer willing to hide that truth, regardless of the consequences it might bring. A heavy silence settled over the hall once the three of them finished speaking. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and Damien felt his heart pounding, with a fear more intense than anything he had experienced during the entire ordeal leading up to this moment. Then, slowly, murmurs began rippling through the crowd, some carrying doubt and discomfort, others carrying something closer to quiet consideration. Felix rose first, his expression stern, and voiced the concerns Damien had expected to hear. He spoke of tradition, of the importance of clear leadership and lineage, of the risks that came with any perceived weakness, in a world where rival packs constantly searched for opportunities to exploit vulnerability. His words carried the weight of decades of established belief, and Damien could sense a portion of the crowd nodding along in quiet agreement. But before Felix could continue further, Priya rose as well, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had earned the respect of the entire pack community over many years of dedicated service. She reminded the gathered crowd of everything Damien had accomplished as a leader throughout his years serving alongside his father, the disputes he had settled fairly, the alliances he had carefully built, the genuine care he had shown for every member of the pack under his protection. She asked the crowd directly whether any of that capability, any of that proven dedication, had changed in the slightest, simply because of the truth he had just spoken aloud. Her words seemed to shift something within the room, a quiet reconsideration rippling through the crowd, as people weighed years of demonstrated leadership against the discomfort of an unfamiliar truth. Nora, surprising many in the room, rose next, admitting that while she had initially shared Felix's concerns, watching Damien, Elena, and Ronan speak so openly and courageously had convinced her that perhaps the pack's definition of strong leadership needed to expand beyond the narrow traditions they had always assumed were essential. The debate that followed stretched on for what felt like hours, filled with passionate arguments from every side, some rooted in genuine concern for the pack's stability, others rooted in prejudice that had never truly been examined, and still others rooted in the growing recognition that loyalty, capability, and genuine care mattered far more than adherence to rigid tradition. Alistair Cross remained largely silent throughout much of the discussion, watching his son navigate this unprecedented challenge with a complicated mixture of fear, pride, and slowly dawning acceptance. Finally, as the debate began to wind down, Alistair rose from his seat, and the entire hall fell silent, waiting for the pack's most senior leader to offer his own judgment on the matter. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent his entire life building the legacy now hanging in the balance. He acknowledged his own initial fear and anger upon learning the truth about his son, admitting openly that years of tradition had shaped his instinctive reaction more than genuine reflection had. But, he continued, he had spent the days since that difficult conversation reflecting on everything Damien had accomplished, everything he continued to demonstrate even now, standing before the entire pack with a courage that Alistair himself was not certain he could have mustered in his son's position. He told the gathered crowd that he had come to believe, after careful consideration, that true strength was not measured by rigid adherence to expectation, but by the willingness to lead with honesty, integrity, and genuine care for the well-being of everyone under one's protection, qualities Damien had demonstrated throughout every year of his life, long before this truth had ever come to light. He formally declared his continued support for his son as the future leader of the Cross Pack, a declaration that carried enormous weight given his position, and one that visibly shifted the mood of the gathered crowd toward cautious acceptance. It was not a unanimous victory. Some pack members left that day still carrying doubts and discomfort that would take considerable time to fully resolve, and Felix, though he did not continue his open opposition, remained visibly unconvinced by the day's proceedings. But for Damien, Elena, and Ronan, standing together at the front of that hall, as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the outcome felt like nothing short of a genuine victory. They had faced the truth openly, without hiding, without pretense, and though the road ahead would undoubtedly still hold challenges, they had taken the first, most difficult step toward building a future defined by honesty rather than fear. In the months that followed, the Cross Pack slowly adjusted to this new understanding of their future leadership. Damien continued serving with the same dedication and capability that had always defined his role, and gradually, even those who had initially struggled with the revelation began to recognize that nothing essential about his leadership had changed. Ronan stepped more fully into his role beside Damien, no longer hiding the depth of their bond, and together they began building a partnership that combined genuine love with dedicated service to the pack they both cared for deeply. Elena, freed from the pretense that had once defined her marriage, finally found the courage to reach out to Julian more openly, and with Damien's genuine blessing and support, the two of them slowly rebuilt the relationship that had been forced apart by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Julian eventually joined the Cross Estate as a welcomed presence in Elena's life, and though their relationship would never fit the traditional mold the pack had once expected, it flourished within the same spirit of honesty that had come to define the entire household. The marriage between Elena and Damien, unconventional as it remained, endured as a genuine partnership built on friendship, mutual respect, and shared history that neither of them would trade for anything. They had been forced together by circumstances entirely outside their control, bound by debt and duty and fear. But what emerged from that forced beginning was something far more valuable than either of them could have imagined on that first difficult night. A bond built not on romantic love, but on unwavering loyalty, understanding, and the shared courage to finally live as their truest selves. Years later, when people throughout the region spoke of the Cross Pack's unusual and celebrated leadership, they spoke not of scandal or shame, but of a family who had chosen honesty over pretense, courage over fear, and genuine connection over rigid tradition. Elena, Damien, and Ronan, along with Julian, built a life together defined not by the roles society had originally assigned them, but by the deep, unshakable bonds they had forged, through honesty, during the most difficult and unexpected chapter of their lives, proving that even the most forced of beginnings could grow into something genuinely and lastingly beautiful.